welcome, Joseph, to the program. I am so honoured and privileged to have you be part of this because, you really embody someone that has dedicated your life to this practice. So it's really a privilege to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Joseph, just to begin, for people that don't know your work or your background, just a very short taste into the background and how you came to mindfulness and the context in which you're teaching mindfulness.
Mm-hmm. I first became interested in mindfulness and in meditation practice when I was in the Peace Corps in Thailand. So this goes back about 50 years, 1965, 1966. And I started going to a discussion group that some Buddhist monks were having for Westerners to talk about meditation. I went to these groups, and I had studied philosophy in college. I went and asked so many questions that people stopped coming to the groups. I think most people are familiar with people like that. So out of desperation, I think one of the monks suggested, why don't you try meditating? Yeah, and I was young. I was 20, 21 years old. This was all very exotic and new. So I get all my paraphernalia together. I sit down. I set my alarm clock for 5 minutes. So I didn't want it to sit too much. But something quite amazing happened in that first 5 minutes. And it wasn't that it was a great enlightenment, but rather I saw that there was a way to look into the mind as well as look out through it. And that turning of the attention in rather than out in a systematic way was revelatory to me, that there was actually a way to understand oneself. I was so excited by this that I started inviting my friends over to watch me meditate, which they didn't come back too often. But that was the beginning. And just since then, over all these years, I've just continued the practice. It was so compelling, and so clear. The teachings were so clear, and the methodology was so clear, that I spent quite a few years in India continuing my practice and study. And then in 1974, came back and started teaching.
Thank you. And just so that the listeners understand the context of where you teach now and...
So at first we were teaching just retreats in different places around the country in a very grassroots ad hoc way. And then after about 1.5 years of this, we had the idea, it would be great if we could start a center. A meditation center where people could come and do intensive meditation retreats, practicing mindfulness. At that time, there were none that I knew, no centers like this that I knew of, in this country. It was all very new. But it was the beginning of a wave of interest. It's as if the timing of bringing this practice back, at least here in the States, it was perfect timing. Tremendous groundswell of interest. And so we found a place. We started a center in Barre, Massachusetts. We just celebrated our 40th anniversary. And so I teach a lot here, but also do a lot of traveling, teaching retreats at different places. Although now, 40 years down the road, I'm also beginning to cut back a little bit.
Yeah, great. Thank you. I'll come back to something around that theme later in the conversation around being and doing and how we kind of bring those together in a way that's not a contradiction. But I'd like to ask you, there are many different definitions of mindfulness, particularly at this point in time in the world where it's become such a kind of buzz thing. What's your understanding and expression of what mindfulness is?
Well, in one way, it's, I think, fairly simple, although one could get into the technicalities of it. And there are many nuances. In fact, as you may know, I just, a year or two ago, wrote this book on mindfulness that's 450 pages long.
Yes, which we'll touch into.
There's a lot of elaboration of it. But basically, it's paying attention to what's arising in the moment, in the mind, in the body, internally, externally, so that we're aware of what's happening rather than not being aware, being distracted or being lost in our own thoughts and daydreams. And to do it in a way, to be mindful in a way that is both discerning but non-reactive. So we become aware of the different elements of our mind, of what's skillful, what's unskillful, what's wholesome, what's unwholesome. But mindfulness is non-reactive to it. So that we're not caught up in a judgmental state of mind. We're simply noticing. But based on that discernment, we can then make wise choices. Mm-hmm. So mindfulness is basically that. In a way, it's knowing that we're knowing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. In your book, which we'll cover a little bit more into, for the listeners, it really is, I read it, I need to read it a number of more times because there is so much in that book that is, as you say, 400 pages. Mindfulness, A Practical Guide to Awakening, a really very accessible dissertation on really where all of this comes from. Yes. In that book, I think there was a quote, "To practice mindfulness is thus a matter not so much of doing but of undoing." Is there anything more that you can say to that in relation to this?
Well, in a way, it's one of the things we see when we're being mindful, when we turn the attention, inward in a way, in terms of watching our own minds. We see that for a good part of the time, we're lost in very habitual patterns of reactivity, of judgment, of commenting, of liking, of disliking, all these patterns which we've been in one way unknowingly practicing our whole lives. And so mindfulness is a way of undoing those reactive patterns, those habituated patterns, so that we can see clearly actually what's arising. And then, as I said, make wiser choices, more conscious choices, rather than reacting habitually to what is arising. Mm-hmm. So in one way, you could say that we're undoing the basic patterns of greed and aversion and ignorance. Mm-hmm. That's what we're undoing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes. As you're speaking, I'm thinking something came up in my mind, which is when I'm teaching meditation a lot, people come to mindfulness meditation, thinking that, it's about finding greater calm, greater relaxation, de-stressing. But from my perspective and my sort of humble understanding and study, it's an experience. It's something so much more than that. I'm wondering if you could speak to, I guess, how you see what the purpose of this practice is for people.
Yeah. I think everything you said is what happens, over time. It's not an immediate, it's not that the first 10 minutes we start practicing, we get calm, but over time, as the practice develops, the calm and the de-stressing and all of those benefits really do start accruing, in our experience. But that is really the foundation and the beginning and the groundwork, in a way, for the development of wisdom. So it's not just about becoming calm, although that's a great thing. We can certainly all use more of that in our lives. But we want to then use that, greater spaciousness in our minds, greater calm, then to look more deeply into the very nature of our minds, our thoughts, our emotions, what leads to happiness, what leads to more suffering. So we're using that to really develop a deep and profound and transforming wisdom. So that, I think, is the higher purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I'm going to kind of jump a little bit here to a question around the way we understand and relate to thoughts. So I think that's really almost like one of the most revelationary, transformative opportunities, in a sense, that mindfulness offers people, particularly that are new to it, this understanding of that I am not my thoughts, or this new relationship that opens up. Could you speak a little bit into that? Because I think, for some people that come to this practice when they're maybe in their 40s, or, it's a profound window that opens up. Could you speak to that?
Yeah. I mean, that is one of the most interesting aspects of the practice, because before we start actually being mindful of our minds, mindful of thoughts, mostly in our lives, we're very identified with them. We take the thoughts to be who we are, and we get very involved in them and caught up in them, and often lost in long trains of thought. And the thoughts can have many different flavors. I mean, sometimes they may have a great deal of wisdom. Sometimes they can be very reactive and judgmental and be causing a lot of suffering. If we're not being mindful of them, we're simply carried along on the train of association. And it's very interesting. And people who have meditated even a little bit have this experience. It's really one of the first insights in insight meditation. How the mind has the tendency to hop on these trains of association, of thought. We don't know that we've hopped on, and we don't know where the train is going. It's all kind of just these deeply established habit patterns in the mind, and then sometime later we become aware that we're thinking, and it's as if we're hopping off the train, sometimes in a very different mental environment because of where we've been. As we learn how to be mindful when thoughts are arising, and at first people are not aware right in the beginning. It's quite difficult, because thoughts are subtle and they come, they're very sneaky. They arise in the mind. We don't know that they're there. But with practice, we learn how to become mindful of thoughts, maybe even in the middle, And in that moment of waking up, of realizing that we're thinking, we begin to see that the thought itself is really empty of substance. It's like, the example I often use is like when we go to the movies, we get totally engrossed in the story, and it can be very compelling. And the story in the movie can elicit all kinds of emotions in us. And then the movie's over and we step outside, it's, I think, a common moment of something happens in the mind expands again, realizing, oh, that was just a movie. Nothing was really happening. That's the experience we have every time we wake up from being lost in a thought. When we recognize, oh, thinking is present. So we're mindful of it rather than lost in it. Now, what's very interesting, and this is one of the most transforming aspects of mindfulness meditation, is realizing how much power thoughts have in our lives when we're not aware that we're thinking. When we're lost in them, it's as if we're the slaves of our thoughts. Go here, go there, do this, do that, which is being driven by our thoughts. And yet when we are aware, when we are mindful of them, we see they have no inherent power at all. Thought as a phenomenon is little more than nothing. It's like this little energy blip in the mind. So that difference between the power they have when we're not aware of them and the ease in the mind when we are aware of them, that's a transformative insight.
And that's kind of where the freedom is, isn't it?
Absolutely. Yeah. Because then we are really freer to choose which thoughts are valuable, which thoughts are useful. So it's not that we're saying that meditation is about not thinking. Rather, meditation is about being mindful of thought so that we can have that wise discernment. This thought is worth acting on. This thought is not. We have that ability to choose wisely.
I mean, when we talk about this and, I've contemplated this, it almost seems criminal that us humans aren't introduced to this notion from a much earlier age, because it's so transformative. And I know, obviously, it's being introduced to schools now, which is a wonderful
Yes.
thing, because really, like, we get a driver's license to drive a car, but we have this mind
Yes.
that no one teaches us about, and it causes so much suffering for our entire lives. So
Exactly.
yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Can I ask you, just to play devil's advocate, because I certainly remember the moment where it clicked for me. Oh, you mean my thoughts aren't me? Like, I don't have to believe these things? But how do you pose a kind of inquiry to someone that is new and hasn't seen this possibility yet, that really kind of might say to you, well, what do you mean? My thoughts are like, whose thoughts are they? They're mine. So how do you kind of help people to access that shift in understanding?
Right. I don't think I would begin for somebody first getting interested in this to emphasize the idea that they're not mine.
Yeah.
Although that is a deeper insight
Sure.
and one that's transforming. But that is hard for most people at the beginning to understand. I think what's easier to understand, and people have a pretty immediate experience of it, first is that thoughts come unbidden. It's not as if we're sitting and we tell ourselves, okay, let this thought come now. So in a way, we begin to see the impersonality of them because they're coming out of our conscious control. They're just arising in the mind by themselves. And so I would emphasize that understanding, and also the fact of their impermanence. When we really are looking at our minds, we see how these thoughts come and go, and the quicker we become aware of them, rather than being lost in them, usually they disappear quite quickly because we're not feeding them. And so as people begin to see the fact that they're coming unbidden, and that they're actually very transitory, and are often disappearing as soon as we become aware of them, that begins to open up the understanding that maybe they don't belong to me, that they're coming out of conditioning. But that understanding is a gradual development.
No, thank you for that. Just in terms of hinting at like the initial doorway into that understanding. Yeah. So on that note, you say that thoughts are impermanent, but we all know that some
very impermanent.
But we all have had that experience where, there might be some thoughts that just keep coming back. There's like this almost like obsessive kind of thinking around this that maybe comes from a deeper place of, as you say, conditioning of, what's happened to us in our past, what's shaped us as human beings, and the core beliefs that we have. And, for example, I think I mentioned, or in the questions I had for you, I think in one of the classes, a woman said to me, but, I look in the mirror and I believe that I'm unattractive and overweight, and there's this really fixed, so then, how could that not be true? That's what I think.
Yes.
So what I'm getting at here is, how can we work, and I know this is more of an advanced question, but I know there are listeners that, have faced this obstacle. What do we do in the practice when there's particular thoughts that sort of keep coming up, the same theme, and maybe it's connected to this principle of letting go, letting be, the principle of acceptance. I'm not sure, but I just wanted to put that forward to you.
I think there are two avenues, of investigation with what we could call recurring or obsessive thoughts in terms of understanding why they're obsessive, and why they keep coming back. So there's two different areas one could look at. So one is really looking at the relationship we have to the thought itself. Usually, it probably will be one of two things. We'll either be having aversion to those thoughts if they're on, but we don't like them, right? And we'd like them to stop. Or if they're particularly pleasant fantasies, maybe it's because we do like them,
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
there's enjoyment of them.
Yeah.
So it could be in both ways. In both ways, we're feeding them. So if a certain thought pattern is there and we have aversion to it,
which
the fact
means
that we
pushing
don't
away.
want it to...
Sorry, yeah.
Yeah, we want it to stop. We want it to go away. The aversion to it is itself feeding the pattern. So this is very important to see. So I'll give you an example, and one that a technique that I often teach, in retreats. A very common pattern in the mind from almost everybody at different times is the judgmental mind. Whether it's judging ourselves or judging others, we just, all through the day, there's just comments, in the mind. So one technique that I suggest people do, and usually it's fed either because we're believing them or we have aversion to it, we don't like it. So what I do is I suggest that people start counting the judgments. Mm-hmm. Judging 1, judging 2, judging 500, judging 7,098. What happens is exactly what your response has been. At a certain moment, at a certain number, we start smiling because we see how ridiculous it is. As soon as we can smile at the judging thoughts, rather than have aversion to them, they cease to be a problem. Because the problem is not the thought itself. The thought is just a momentary arising. Doesn't matter how often it comes if we're not reactive to it. If we just, this is just another passing thought. This is self-judgment 998. And we smile. Yeah. So then we've really freed ourselves from the reactivity. And because we're no longer reacting to them, it actually starts to decondition their arising. Because we're not feeding them, the judging mind starts to come less and less. So it's our reaction to the thoughts that is the first area of investigation, not only seeing that it's there, but are we simply letting it arise and pass, or do we have aversion to it? Do we not want it? And realizing that not wanting it is feeding it. So that's the first approach. The second approach with regard to obsessive kinds of thought patterns, very often they're fed by an unacknowledged emotion. So there can be an emotion underneath. And if we're not mindful of that, if we're identified with or caught in or even unaware of that emotion will be the underground string for all these thoughts. So, for example, in terms of the example you used, of the woman who was looking in the mirror and having these negative thoughts about self-image, and be interesting, okay, what's the emotion that's really underneath? It might be shame, it might be fear, it might be, I don't know, it could be a lot of different things. If one is able to actually drop down and become mindful of the emotion, and mindful in the same way of opening to it, accepting the fact that it's there, and just really exploring, this emotion feels like this. So we take an investigative outlook rather than a judgmental one. Then we start freeing ourselves on a deeper level, from a pattern that may have hooked us for a long time. So this is incorporating the awareness of emotion into the practice of mindfulness. It's not just about thoughts.
Yeah, fantastic. Okay. So I guess, look, I'm aware of the time, and this gets very deep, and, I wish I had 8 hours to explore all the different things in your book, and I think for the listener, at least this is opening up the potential and the possibility of what is here in this practice. So yes, it is calm, it is relaxation, but it really it's deeply transformative.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, one of the things I've been practicing now for, about 50 years, and the thing that has sustained the energy for the practice over all of these years is just this incredible interest in the working of our minds and hearts, because our whole lives are the unfolding of what's happening within us. And so to have a methodology, which is what mindfulness is, for the investigation, first on more surface levels and then on deeper levels, it's endlessly interesting.
And I think also the bonus of that is, for me, I've realized, life is inevitably full of joy, but also challenges and difficulty. And so if we have this practice, it means that almost the difficult times are just this opportunity for greater spiritual personal growth and wisdom. So that
absolutely,
yeah,
absolutely. I mean, I've found that often the times of suffering are the times, if we have a way and interest in understanding what the cause of it is, sometimes those are the times that are the most deeply transformative.
I want to ask you a question on that before we jump into a practice, which is around the principle of acceptance that is infused in sort of mindfulness in general. And I think what's interesting is that what I've discovered for myself and from teaching people is that people come to this practice usually at a point in their life where there's some kind of transition or there's some kind of not okayness. And so inherent in that is a sense of, I want things to be different to how they are right now. And yet in this practice, there's an invitation of acceptance. Can you just contextualize where that acceptance fits in here and how we're not necessarily, are we talking about, it's not a passive, resigned kind of acceptance. Can you speak a little bit to the acceptance and how that actually supports transformation, perhaps?
Yeah, the acceptance really has to do with accepting what the truth of our present moment experience is. So if there's some difficult emotion, if there's fear or there's loneliness or there's jealousy or there's anger or positive emotions, the acceptance means that it's as if we step back and open up and feel the experience fully without judgment, without pushing away, without holding on. So we're really open to what's there. In that acceptance, as I mentioned earlier, then there's the possibility of a discernment, a wise discernment. Okay, what is skillful in this situation? What is unskillful? Is this emotion helpful? Is it the cause of my happiness? Is it the cause of suffering? And based on this discernment, we actually then can make choices. We said, no, this is something that I want to be aware of and let go of. This is something that I want to be aware of and develop. And so it's not, the meditation doesn't stop simply with acceptance. The acceptance is the foundation for clear seeing, and then the clear seeing is the foundation for wise choice. Wise choice brings greater happiness. Greater happiness allows us to see more clearly. Seeing more clearly allows us to make wiser choices. And so it's really a spiral upward. And this is what mindfulness provides. There's a lot of emphasis in the teachings about this discernment, and the jargon uses the term skillful and unskillful, or wholesome and unwholesome. But it basically has to do with those mind states that are the cause of suffering in our lives and those that are the cause of happiness and peace. And the one is to be let go of and the other is to be cultivated.
And this recognition that we do have a choice, actually.
Absolutely. And the choice really comes when we're mindful of what's present. If we're not mindful, then we're simply lost in the habit patterns of our conditioning. And we're just playing out over and over again our habitual patterns. So that's the great gift of mindfulness. It allows us to step out of that habitual reaction and see more clearly and choose more wisely.
And this possibility then infuses really all aspects of our life, whether it's in our relationships, in our parenting,
Absolutely.
in our work, and managing teams and leadership.
Everything. And it is our whole life. Just as an example of an application, which is, on the one hand, very obvious but mostly ignored, is the profound influence of mindfulness on our speech. We speak a lot during the course of the day. And usually the words just come tumbling out. Without practice, we usually are not considering, okay, what's the motivation behind what I'm about to say? Is it a wholesome one? Is it an unwholesome one? Is it true? Is it useful? Mindfulness brought to that area of our everyday lives has a huge impact. Because we begin to see before we speak, we begin to be aware, oh, I'm about to say this. This may not be so skillful. I don't have to say it. And this has tremendous ramifications for all our relationships.
So this sense that we're stopping being these automatons, these kind of automatic pilot humans that just kind of blah, 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 and like the thoughts come and they just attack. Whereas now there's we're actually stepping into a sense of agency in relation to all these automatic thoughts that just keep spinning around the mind and which ones we're choosing to continue on with or let go of.
Yes.
Okay. Joseph, thank you so much. I would love to invite you now to, I suppose, guide some practice for us, and maybe it would be great if you could maybe guide a 10-minute practice that maybe connects to possibly exploring emotion, or maybe something around an investigation of emotion, or whatever you feel in the moment.
Well, we can include that, but of course people may be doing the practice and not necessarily be experiencing any strong emotion at the time. So, but I'll kind of include that possibility. Yeah,
or otherwise, perhaps, because in the program people are being introduced to the groundwork of body scan and breath, which obviously is part of all the practices. But if there could be, maybe we could introduce something around the idea of the thoughts or in relation to what we're talking. Great.
Okay.
Yeah. And so, it would be about a 10-minute, roughly 10, 15-minute practice, whatever you have. Yeah. Cool.
Okay, so if everybody listening or watching takes a comfortable seat, and it's helpful if the body in the back is reasonably straight, what I call a dignified posture, but not tense, not forcing anything. Just very relaxed, open, and begin by feeling the body. Just open to the body. A phrase that's very helpful to begin the practice. Just repeating a few times, there is a body. There is a body. And we just settle into the awareness of our sitting posture. There is a body. And allowing ourselves to feel whatever arises within that frame. There is a body. You may feel certain sensations of touch, the feet on the floor, the buttocks on the cushion of the chair. You might feel the sensations of the body breathing. Simply sit and know you're sitting. Repeating the phrase, there is a body, to create the frame for experience. Notice and feel whatever is arising within that frame. Different bodily sensations, the feeling of the body breathing. And become aware of any sounds that may be appearing, noticing how the sounds simply come and go. Pay particular attention to the arising of thought or image in the mind. Thoughts as words in the mind, images as pictures in the mind. And in the very moment that you become aware that there's thinking or seeing, you might make a very soft mental note, a mental label, thinking, or seeing. And notice what happens to the thought or image in the moment of becoming aware of it. Does it continue? Does it disappear? Staying grounded in the awareness of the body. There is a body. Aware of the body breathing. Aware of sounds. And noticing whenever thoughts or images arise. Making the soft mental note of thinking or seeing. Begin to notice when in the thought process you become aware. Is it after the thought is already finished? Is it in the middle of the thought? Is it just as it arises? And all of that is fine. It's simply to notice when we become aware of thought or image. Coming back to the body as the ground of awareness. There is a body. Feeling the breath, aware of sound. Noticing thought or image. You can pay attention to the quality of the mind. Whatever emotions might be present or mind states, is there calm or restlessness? Is there boredom? Is there interest? Is there expectation? Is there acceptance? Simply to check in with what the attitude or the mind state is in the mind from time to time. Oh, the mind is like this right now. Noticing and noting the mind state. Experiencing its nature. And again, coming back to awareness of the body. Sometimes a particular thought will trigger a strong emotion. Perhaps a thought triggers anger, or fear, or desire, or love. If some strong emotion should arise, become mindful of that emotion, that feeling. Using the soft mental note to acknowledge its presence. Anger feels like this. Love feels like this. We become aware of these stronger emotions with a mindful acceptance. And again, grounding the awareness in the body. There is a body. Using mindfulness of the body as a foundation, stay alert for the arising of thoughts and images in the mind. Noting thinking, noting seeing. In the moment we become aware of them. Notice what happens to them as we're aware. Do they stay? Do they disappear? And becoming mindful of any particular mind state or emotion. Noting it, feeling it, experiencing its nature, noticing how it changes, and again, coming back to awareness of the body. And we can end our meditation practice with the dedication that the energy of our mindfulness, the energy of our awareness, of our aspirations, be for the welfare and the happiness of all beings everywhere. When you're ready, you can slowly open your eyes, reconnect with the world around you. If I had a bell, I would ring the bell now.
Thank you so much.